Welcome back to Superbly Said Advanced English Vocabulary and Phrases. Today we are reviewing a SpeakDuo English lesson presentation titled How the Office Fixed Andy Bernard in a single episode. You can go to SpeakDuo.com to meet new people from around the world who are practicing English on video calls to become more confident with their English speaking abilities.
The vocabulary definitions provided in the lesson are currently too one-dimensional to fully serve an advanced English learning audience. The core weakness we are seeing here is that the source material introduces genuinely complex idioms like a conundrum and to brown nose, but it relies on basic definitions and just single, straightforward context sentences. This approach really fails to address the nuanced understanding and the professional application that advanced learners, especially those preparing for IELTS or corporate environments, need to truly master the language.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's just a bit too...
Surface level, right?
Exactly, surface level. So my suggestion is to expand the teaching notes for each phrase by directly comparing it to a similar but different alternative. Clearly explaining the nuanced differences between them. Additionally, we really need to incorporate context-specific examples that model how these phrases are actually used in high-level environments. Let's look closely at how to put that into practice across the vocabulary list, starting with the first expression, a conundrum.
That is a perfect place to start. If we are teaching a conundrum, we need to explicitly compare it to the alternative, a problem. Because a problem can be incredibly simple and straightforward, right? Like getting a flat tire on your way to work. But a conundrum implies a deeply confusing dilemma or a difficult decision with no easy way out, often involving conflicting priorities.
Right, and a great way to demonstrate its use in an example sentence representing a conversation with work colleagues or your boss would be, choosing whether to cut the marketing budget or reduce the sales staff is a massive conundrum for the executive team. Furthermore, if someone is responding to a question from IELTS Speaking Part 2 where they are asked to describe a difficult decision, they could say, when I received 2 competing job offers in different countries, it presented a real conundrum as I had to weigh rapid career growth against being close to my family.
Yeah, that distinction is what elevates a student's lexical resource score. Building on that pedagogical approach, what if we looked at the next phrase, to take something in stride? The necessary comparison here is with a similar alternative like to ignore a problem.
Spot on. Because the nuanced difference we need to teach is that ignoring a problem implies negligence or avoidance. On the other hand, taking it in stride implies handling a difficulty calmly, accepting it without letting it disrupt your workflow or your emotional state.
A concrete example for a workplace conversation with a manager could be, I know the project timeline was completely overhauled at the last minute, but the entire development team took it in stride and met the new deadline.
And for an IELTS context, perhaps discussing workplace stress, a candidate might offer, professionals who can take unexpected failures in stride are generally more successful than those who panic at the first sign of trouble.
Let's consider the phrase to brown nose. Is there a risk that focusing solely on the basic definition, trying too hard to please someone, might overlook its inherently negative social connotation?
Oh, absolutely. We must compare it to the phrase to compliment or to show respect. The vital difference is that complimenting someone is genuine and positive, while brown-nosing is deeply manipulative, insincere, and done specifically to gain an unfair advantage. It's a phrase that carries heavy corporate politics.
To model that for an advanced learner, a professional example could be, instead of focusing on improving his actual sales numbers, he spent the entire quarter trying to brown-nose the regional director to secure a promotion.
Or if an IELTS candidate is discussing toxic workplace dynamics, they could say, in certain corporate cultures, employees often feel that brown-nosing is rewarded more heavily than actual hard work and merit.
Moving to the verb to overhaul, we can compare this to the alternative to tweak or to adjust. The distinction here is purely about the scale of the action. To adjust something means to make minor incremental changes, but to overhaul means to completely deconstruct, rebuild, and thoroughly change a system from the ground up.
Advanced learners need to know this word carries significant weight. A concrete example sentence to represent a conversation with a boss would be,
After the disastrous quarterly earnings report, the CEO decided to completely overhaul the company's marketing strategy.
And for an IELTS speaking exam concerning city infrastructure, one could clearly state the city council needs to overhaul the public transportation system because minor repairs are no longer sufficient to handle the rapid population growth.
Next up, we have a payoff. Let's contrast this with a salary or a payment. While a salary is a guaranteed transactional exchange for your daily labor, a payoff in this metaphorical context is the ultimate positive result, reward, or satisfying conclusion brought about by extended patience, massive risk, or incredibly hard work.
Right, it carries a heavy emotional weight of delayed gratification. A fantastic workplace example would be, we spent 6 straight months working overtime on the software architecture, but the final product's flawless launch was a massive payoff.
For an IELTS candidate discussing the value of education, they might note, studying advanced mathematics for years can be mentally exhausting, but the payoff is the ability to easily transition into high-paying engineering roles later in life.
Let's examine the phrase to shun someone. We should contrast this heavily with simply to disagree with someone. You can absolutely disagree with a colleague while still working comfortably alongside them. However, to shun is an active, deliberate, and often collective sociological choice to completely avoid, ignore, or socially reject a person, usually as a severe form of punishment.
A concrete example for the office could be, after it was discovered that he was stealing credit for other people's work, the rest of the department effectively began to shun him during all collaborative meetings.
In an IELTS setting discussing social behavior or community norms, a speaker could explain, in highly close-knit communities, individuals who break important cultural rules are often shunned by their neighbors.
That brings us to an unrequited love. The necessary comparison here is with a breakup or a rejection. A rejection is typically a single isolated event, but an unrequited love is a persistent, enduring emotional state where one person holds strong romantic affection that is sadly not returned by the other, often causing prolonged distress over years.
To model this in a sophisticated sentence, the novel explores the protagonist's descent into bitterness after a decade of unrequited love for his closest friend.
If responding to an IELTS Part 2 prompt asking to describe a memorable book or movie, a student could say, the main conflict of the film is driven entirely by an unrequited love that clouds the hero's judgment and motivates his terrible decisions.
Finally, let's look at to root for someone. We can compare this directly to expect someone to win. You might expect a massive, wealthy corporation to win a lawsuit based purely on their resources, but you don't necessarily support them. To root for someone means you actively, emotionally support them and desperately want them to succeed, usually because they are the underdog or facing great adversity.
A perfect conversational example with colleagues would be, even though our startup is competing against industry giants, all the local investors are genuinely rooting for us to succeed.
In an IELTS context about sports or competition, a speaker might share, I always root for the amateur athletes at the Olympics because their personal stories of sacrifice and dedication are so inspiring.
Now let's shift gears slightly. The current spacing of the interactive breakout sessions disrupts the momentum of the vocabulary acquisition phase.
Yes, exactly. The main weakness in the lesson's structural flow is that it introduces a couple of expressions, like a conundrum meant to take something in stride, and immediately jumps to a breakout room, then repeats the start and stop pattern throughout the entire deck.
This heavily fragmented pacing prevents students from building a substantial bank of words before being asked to use them, which makes the remote video conversations far less dynamic and severely limits cognitive synthesis.
The best way to resolve this is to consolidate the instruction of the vocabulary terms into fewer, larger blocks, followed by more comprehensive breakout sessions where students are challenged to synthesize multiple expressions at once. Let's talk about how to execute that structurally.
To put that into practice, instead of stopping after the very first 2 phrases, you should teach a conundrum, to take something in stride, to brown nose, and to overhaul in one continuous, engaging pedagogical flow. Give the students a real toolkit to work with.
And following that larger instructional block, you design a breakout room prompt that requires the partners to use at least 3 of those newly learned words in a single narrative.
For example, the slide could prompt students with, describe a workplace scenario where someone tried to brown-nose the boss during a massive department overhaul, and explain whether the rest of the team took it in stride or found it to be a massive conundrum.
That is excellent. It forces a much deeper level of language processing and makes the video call practice significantly more valuable. But moving on to the end of the lesson concludes abruptly without an active recall mechanism to solidify the student's grasp of the new material.
The critical weakness here is ending the presentation immediately after the final expression and a final breakout room. This entirely misses an opportunity to test the learner's retention.
Without a comprehensive review, learners log off from the video call without a clear sense of whether they have accurately internalized the nuanced meanings we just spent so much time establishing.
To fix this, my suggestion is to implement a structured, interactive multiple-choice quiz at the very end of the lesson. The instructor should announce the options as Option A, Option B, and Option C. It is vital to repeat the relevant phrase as much as you can to remind the audience what they're trying to guess the definition for.
Furthermore, give the audience a little time to think by actively telling them to pause the critique before providing the immediate answers, making sure to repeat the relevant phrase again and give a quick reminder of the example covered earlier.
Let's conduct that exact quiz right now to demonstrate how seamlessly this active recall segment can integrate into the lesson flow. We will model the exact options you should be presenting to your students. Let's do it. Question 1. What is the best definition for the expression, a conundrum? Option A, a thoroughly detailed and officially approved corporate agreement. Option B, a deeply confusing and particularly difficult problem or question. Option C, a surprisingly obvious and completely unexpected quick resolution. Feel free to pause the critique here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer is Option B. A conundrum is a deeply confusing and particularly difficult problem or question. Remember our earlier example about the massive conundrum of choosing between cutting the marketing budget or reducing the sales staff?
Question 2. If you manage to take something in stride, what are you doing? Option A, to intentionally ignore a direct order from a senior board member. Option B, to successfully accomplish a highly demanding physical assignment. Option C, to handle a difficult problem calmly without letting it upset you. Feel free to pause the critique here to consider your choice.
The answer is Option C. To take something in stride means to handle a difficult problem calmly without letting it upset you. Just like the development team that took the massive project overhaul in stride and still calmly met their deadlines.
Question 3. What does it mean when an employee tries to brown nose? Option A, to try excessively hard to please a boss to gain a real advantage. Option B, to aggressively interrogate a close coworker during an evaluation. Option C, to completely fabricate a false narrative to escape strict bounds. Pause the critique here if you need a moment.
The correct choice is Option A. To brown nose means to try excessively hard to please a boss to gain a real advantage. We highlighted this nuance with the example of the employee who spent the whole quarter trying to brown nose the regional director instead of doing actual hard work.
Question 4. Which of the following describes the verb to overhaul? Option A, to intentionally conceal minor flaws within a complicated project. Option B, to thoroughly change, completely rebuild, or entirely improve it. Option C, to aggressively complain about a difficult and exhausting process. Feel free to pause the critique here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer is Option B. To overhaul means to thoroughly change, completely rebuild, or entirely improve it. Think back to the CEO who decided to completely overhaul the company's failing marketing strategy from the ground up.
Question 5. What exactly is a payoff in the context of hard work? Option A, a sudden and totally unexpected financial disaster for a business. Option B, a secretly negotiated and entirely illegal corporate transaction. Option C, a highly satisfying conclusion resulting from dedicated hard work. Pause the critique right here if you want to guess.
It is Option C. A payoff is a highly satisfying conclusion resulting from dedicated hard work. This was perfectly captured by our example of working 6 months of overtime to finally experience the massive payoff of a flawless software launch.
Question 6. What occurs when you decide to shun someone? Option A, to deliberately avoid, actively ignore, or completely reject them. Option B, to physically threaten a difficult person during a loud argument. Option C, to successfully persuade an individual to accept a massive change. Feel free to pause the critique here if you need to think about the answer.
The right answer is option A. To shun someone means to deliberately avoid, actively ignore, or completely reject them. We saw this in the sociological workplace scenario where the department decided to shun the colleague who was constantly stealing credit.
Question 7. How is an unrequited love best defined according to the lesson? Option A, a deeply passionate and mutually respectful long-term partnership. Option B, a strong feeling of romantic affection that is sadly not returned. Option C, a completely unexpected and highly dramatic professional betrayal. Take a moment and pause the critique here to reflect.
The correct answer is option B. An unrequited love is a strong feeling of romantic affection that is sadly not returned. This enduring state was illustrated by the protagonist who spent a decade dealing with the bitterness of unrequited love for his closest friend.
Finally, question 8. What does it mean to root for someone? Option A, to openly show active support for a person who is struggling hard. Option B, to secretly gather highly confidential information about a worker. Option C, to forcefully criticize a new colleague during a long discussion. Feel free to pause the critique here if you need to think about the final answer.
The last answer is option A. To root for someone means to openly show active support for a person who's struggling hard. Recall the example of the local investors genuinely rooting for the underdog startup to succeed against massive industry giants. Providing this kind of structured, immediate feedback right at the end of the lesson ensures that the nuanced vocabulary comparisons we built earlier are permanently anchored in the students' long-term memories.
To quickly recap the main points of today's critique, we focused heavily on elevating the advanced learner's experience. We discussed the critical need to add nuanced vocabulary comparisons rather than relying on basic definitions, illustrating how context dictates meaning.
We also addressed fixing the heavily fragmented pacing of the breakout rooms to allow for better conversational synthesis and reduced cognitive friction. Lastly, we modeled the implementation of a comprehensive multiple-choice end-of-lesson quiz to actively test and ensure long-term retention.
To summarize the actionable steps you can take today, first, flesh out every single vocabulary definition with comparative examples suited specifically for professional workplaces or IELTS testing contexts.
Second, group your vocabulary teaching blocks together so students have a larger arsenal of words to weave together before sending them into the remote breakout sessions. And third, build out the specific 3-option active recall quiz section we just modeled right before the final slide.
We invite the listener to implement these structural and content changes, apply the nuanced comparative examples we've outlined, and submit your revised lesson deck back to the show for further feedback. We are always excited to see how your educational materials evolve.